Hello, John.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm pretty good. Hey, I just have to ask you something.
Wait, I have to introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. You're John Horgan. This is the Wright Show, available on streaming video as well as audio podcast. Okay, you can proceed now.
And this is John Horgan, science journalist. I teach at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. And I just wanted to ask, you just alluded to, before we got on, having coffee. You're not just waking up now, are you?
Actually, well, no, not at the moment. I mean, what time is it? It's 9:45. I have been on a kind of a, well, the fact that I can't finish this sentence, I guess, partly answers your question, doesn't it? The caffeine hasn't really hit, but that's partly because I do some things before I drink the coffee. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I've been up for a couple of hours, but that's, or more actually, but that's later than usual. I've been erratic lately. What?
You don't have caffeine right after you get up?
Not right after I get up. No, I do like a few exercises and things, and I meditate a little.
I thought, yeah. See, I can't meditate unless I'm caffeinated because otherwise I get sleepy and bored, and so I need. But then of course the problem is then my monkey mind goes nuts, and because it's all caffeinated. So, yeah, I just end up...
Caffeine can be good for meditation in my experience, but I generally don't. I generally refrain.
Okay, I know this is off topic, but I can't help it.
People don't even know what the topic is, so you don't have to worry about that. For all they know, it is on topic. We should tell them. We should tell them in case they haven't read the promotional materials. We're going to actually talk about... sexual harassment and predation in science and academia. But now you can get back off topic.
All right. So Alison Gopnik, who's this really amazing developmental psychologist.
Right. I had a conversation with her on this on Meaning of Life TV a few months ago.
Okay, so people know how cool she is. And anyway, she does a lot of research on kids. And one of the things that she said, as I recall, is that kids' minds are in this kind of manic state. They're extremely imaginative, and they're always searching for new possibilities out there. And she said that one of the reasons is that they are naturally caffeinated, and that when we oldsters drink coffee or tea, that we are actually replicating sort of the state of children.
Mm-hmm. So, well, and of course, there's this book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, suggesting that the Zen state of mind is in some ways a childlike state of mind. So I guess all of this just goes to show that yes, you should drink coffee before meditating.
Right. Except that coffee for me, I get the initial rush, which is great, and then it kind of jams my mind, and my mind feels very grown up and adult and even old very quickly. So it's got like a little window where
when does the window hit? How many minutes after drinking the coffee? What's the
Almost immediately. I think the suggestibility is so strong that as I'm lifting...
Yeah, that's what I think. See, I think the actual effect is like an hour after you drink it, but through conditioning, you come to anticipate the effect like right after drinking it. But that part is false.
Well, an hour later, that seems much too... I'm already crashing after an hour.
Well, different people's metabolisms will differ.
Yeah, and I drink a lot too. I drink usually. I'm looking over at my coffee maker. I drink I drink 2 mugs, so that's maybe 3, almost 4 cups. It's too much. I got to cut back.
Depends on how strong it is. If it's Midwestern coffee, it's not enough.
It's strong. I make my coffee really strong.
Yeah, it's too much.
Okay.
Explains a lot. Explains a lot of the trouble you get yourself into.
Yeah, that might be true.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm trying to meditate a little bit. But we're going to talk. I think what the world needs right now
is 2 males.
Right.
2 males talking about sexual harassment.
Yeah. Let's see if we can get this figured out for our female friends and colleagues and all that. And I do have some thoughts on this. First, I want to point out that I work at an engineering school which only became co-ed in the 1970s, and still is the student population, undergraduate, is only about, I think the last figure I saw was maybe 25% female. The faculty is also about 25% female. Engineering has been traditionally a real male-dominated.
But that's probably pretty high as engineering schools go, isn't it? The faculty, 25% women or not?
Actually, I don't know in terms of comparison to other schools like MIT or Caltech. That's a good question. But I'm just saying that this sort of gender imbalance in engineering is something that's made me reflect on gender differences. I also just want to point out that Scientific American had a sexual harassment scandal a few years ago that actually made the news.
And we should say that you blog at Scientific American and have long been affiliated. You were back. There was a time when you were actually at some kind of actual Scientific American office involved in putting out a physical magazine or something, right?
Yeah, I was a staff writer for 11 years. I left in 97, but I've been blogging for them since 2010. And the guy who used to oversee the bloggers, his name was Boris Zivkovic, and he was somebody who was like this celebrated figure in science blogging. He really generated a lot of excitement about the possibilities of blogging about scientists, both for scientists and journalists. And he collected this big group of bloggers for Scientific American. And then he was charged with sexual harassment by a bunch of different women, and he had to step down.
Women at Scientific American.
This is at Scientific American.
And what kinds of things had he been allegedly doing?
I don't want to go into the details. I'm always, even in talking about this subject, I'm worried about misspeaking and being subject
especially
to
once you've mentioned a name. Yeah, you should be careful.
Litigation. But I mean, this guy, there's lots of stuff online about this, but it was just sort of inappropriate behavior toward women, and especially toward female bloggers, some of whom he had recruited as bloggers for Scientific American. So again, this made me reflect. I've always thought of science journalism as being remarkably gender equal. So the editor-in-chief of Scientific American is a woman. When I was at Scientific American in the 90s, I had a couple of supervisors who were female. But I think one thing that's clear with this whole, I don't know what to call it, maybe the Harvey Weinstein episode, is that sexual harassment is everywhere. There is no field that is immune to it. Scientific American just had a big piece within the last couple of weeks spelling out how pervasive sexual harassment
is. The definition of it is changing, right?
Well, I mean, this was.
Can I do a digression and ask you a question to help kind of clarify? When I was in college, I remember there were like two kinds of guys who were more assertive with women than I was. I mean, virtually every guy was more assertive with women than I was, but there were two kinds. One was like the jockey kind, and that was one kind. But there was also this kind of like, he might be like a granola kind of guy who did yoga, or he might be in drama, but here would be his MO. There'd be like a couple of guys, two or three women, they'd be talking, and he'd walk up to one of the women and just start giving her a shoulder massage. Do you remember this type of person?
Yeah.
But now, and I always thought, well, he's got more courage than I do, but I didn't think, and I guess maybe I thought, I wonder if she really likes that. But I didn't think, but nobody would have reported someone for doing that, right?
Right.
And now, but now that is sometimes, that kind of thing is sometimes on the list of particulars in these cases that come to light, right?
Well,
and it's fine with me if the definition of sexual harassment expands. I personally am my feeling about physical space is stay the hell away from me, right? And I think everyone has the right for that to be their policy. Someone you don't know should not just walk up and touch you, or don't know very well. So I'm fine with the expansion of the definition, but I am right, that there has been an expansion of the definition.
Yes, and I think one thing that's clear is that the definition has come more from males than from females. There's a theme in all these stories of women talking about powerful men who were coming on to them doing various things, which is that the men had one idea of what was happening, what they were doing, and the women had a totally different idea, which is that even when they were going along with it, they didn't like it.
Right.
And they were afraid or intimidated, and they didn't want to say anything. So that would suggest that some of those women who are getting massages from these guys, the crunchy granola, hippie, bearded type, actually didn't like it. Except the difference is the recent cases we're talking about, there's a power imbalance. And I think there is,
but there is a different kind of leverage in a sense in the situations I'm talking about, which is that it's just really awkward for a woman in that kind of setting to say, get your hands off me. It's almost impossible. It would be a lot easier if they were alone, oddly, and there was no power differential. That would probably be easier for her to just kind of like move away, but it's a little awkward in a social situation. But I take your point that it's a good point that usually when we see like unwanted shoulder massages in the Bill of Particulars in these new cases, there is a power differential. And that's part of the deal. It might be an out-and-out boss, or it might just be someone like Harvey Weinstein who has a huge amount of power.
Well, but this is making me reflect on my own behavior in ways that are unsettling for me. So I was talking about this about these cases with my girlfriend and my daughter recently. And I was describing my interactions with some of my female colleagues at Stevens and how I sometimes would compliment them on their clothing. And both my girlfriend and my daughter said, Dad, don't do that anymore.
Right.
That's creepy. That's
bad. A good example.
I said, okay, wow. All right. So I shouldn't reflect on their physical, I shouldn't comment on their physical appearance in any way. Although I must say, I just went to the Christmas party last night at my school, and I went with several female colleagues, and I was actually wearing a tie. Mm-hmm. And they commented, "Oh, John, you're wearing a tie. How unusual is that? And you look great in a tie."
Yeah, well, here we get at the question of whether, and this is typically unspoken, but the issue of symmetry between the genders. And a lot of what we're hearing, there's an assumption that there isn't symmetry of expectation about about the way they'll behave toward, but that's not very often stated because it's considered kind of uncool to state that there's a little tension between some versions of feminism, and there are a lot of versions of feminism, but some versions of feminism involve the idea that there just are no differences like between men and women, that are. Well, I shouldn't go on because I'll mischaracterize the dogma. But you take my point. There is something called so-called difference feminism, which emphasizes how different men and women are. And then there's different kinds. And I don't know. But this part of the discussion doesn't get had explicitly.
Well, so I told you the last time we spoke, I'm writing this book, finishing this book on the mind-body problem. I interviewed a lot of people who, to me, were really fascinating. One of the most fascinating is an economist named Deirdre McCloskey,
who underwent
sex change operation in her 50s. This was in the mid 90s. Her name was Donald McCloskey, and she was a very well known conservative, laissez-faire economist. And then she decided that she really wanted to be. He decided he really wanted to be a woman. And had hormone injections and finally.
I actually had a conversation with her on Blogging Heads too long ago.
Well, I spent a weekend with her in Chicago 2 summers ago. And so she was a male and then became a female. And, so she wrote this whole memoir about how the world looks different to her as a female. And she says things like relationships matter more. And she said a lot of things. That in particular struck me. Relationships matter more to her as a female than they did when she was a male. She's less aggressive than she was. These are the sorts of things that Google engineer was saying in his memo that got him in trouble. He said women care more about people, men care more about things. And that was considered to be a sexist thing to say. And here is this transgender person who had been a man and became a woman, and he's saying things that are very similar. And by the way, McCloskey has been criticized by a lot of feminists for propagating stereotypes about both men and women in his writing. But he's just trying to she is just trying to honestly express how she feels both before and after her change. So there's so many different complications when you're talking about this, both from the scientific, if you're just trying to figure out what's really going on, what are the differences, that's hard enough. But then when you're also trying to figure out what are the right things to say, what is ethically correct, what is politically correct, when you're talking within the context of the gender wars that are happening.
Yeah.
But Bob, here's a question I wanted to ask you. I was thinking about. It seems to me that one of the questions raised by male behavior recently is, what are men really like?
Okay, you want me to answer the question, what men are really like?
Well, so this is an old question, and it goes back to a dialogue between Socrates, one of Plato's dialogues. It's Socrates talking to a guy named Glaucon, and it's about, what are men really like? And when they're talking about human nature, it's always male nature. Mm-hmm. It almost don't exist. And Glaucon says that he thinks men are basically pigs. And so he has a little thought experiment. He says that there's this shepherd, and he finds a magic ring that makes him invisible, and so he can do anything he wants and get away with it.
Right.
And what does he do? He goes to the palace and he kills the king, and then takes his wife and takes all his stuff.
Yeah.
And Glaucon says that's the fantasy of every man, that if you take the fear away, the fear of punishment, the fear of being caught, the fear of being disapproved of, that men are pigs, they're predators, they're just beasts. And Socrates says, well, the wise man wouldn't do those bad things, because the wise man would realize that if he just indulges in his appetites, that he's a slave to them. Mm-hmm. And that's not wisdom. That's not a good life. That's being a puppet ruled by your own appetites. And so I've been thinking about this a lot, because it's like a really important question. What are we really like? If you strip away our fear and all our sort of brainwashing that we endure since the time we're little boys, about what it means to be good and how we should behave toward girls and all that kind of stuff, what it means to be a good person. Are we really savage beasts? These powerful men like Harvey Weinstein, I'd have to say Bill Clinton now, when you reach a certain level of power, it's kind of like you have the ring that makes you invisible, right? You think you can get away with anything.
Yeah. And in fact, I haven't, it's not like, my position on these guys is pretty clear that they're getting punished is good. On the other hand, there's a kind of judgment I'm not willing to pass I mean, in general, my view is that we should always, always punish people with, in a certain sense, regret. It's like punishment is never a good thing in itself. It's good because we need to discourage certain kinds of behavior. And one reason I always put it that way is my feeling is always kind of there, but for the grace of God go I. If I had been, in general, if I had been born with certain genes in a certain environment, I'd be very different than I am. And in these cases, my feeling is kind of like, well, I've never had the kind of temptation and power these guys have. And so I can't say for sure, you know, that I would be a Boy Scout about it, you know, and, but as for your point, as for the question, if you'd like me to tell you what I'm in really like, here's the answer. Well, I don't have the answer, but I do want to say something that does pertain ultimately to the Google memo. So I've written about evolutionary psychology, right? My book on that is like, whatever, 23 years old. An important part of evolutionary psychology is the idea that some differences in psychology between the genders do have, in some sense, a genetic basis. Doesn't mean they're unchangeable or anything, but it means all other things being equal, you're going to see statistical differences between the sexes. Now, that said, the differences that are kind of clearly predicted by Darwinian theory, okay, like, for example, getting back to the fact that women cannot reproduce more than once a year, whereas men can, in principle, reproduce every day if they can find a new woman every day to cooperate, right? That difference in any species is thought by pretty much any evolutionary biologist to have consequences for the behavioral strategies that are optimal for the two in Darwinian terms of getting genes in the next generation, and therefore implications for the psychology that you would expect to evolve, at least to the extent that the psychology has a genetic basis, okay? So there definitely are, it's just hard to imagine taking natural selection seriously and really looking at the way it works and the way it works in other animals and the various evidence and saying, oh, I don't think there are any differences between men and women statistically that have anything to do with genes. That, to me, is kind of to deny the evidence. Now, that said... What?
Can I object?
You can, but first let me say one other thing. That said, the Google memo mainly talked about things that Darwinian theory doesn't make clear predictions about, okay? And it kind of, as I recall, I could be misremembering, but like David Brooks wrote a column about the Google memo, I think kind of defending it and associating it with evolutionary psychology. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure. Somebody did it. I think it was David Brooks. It kind of drove me nuts because the Google memo was talking about a bunch of things other than actual, sexual behavior and mate choice and things where there are pretty clear predictions and a lot of evidence on, and it was getting into like how good they are at certain intellectual tasks and a bunch of stuff where there may be some data suggesting that there are some statistical differences, but Darwinian theory doesn't necessarily weigh in on it and suggest strongly that they are genetically based differences. And the Google memo was mainly about things where there are not clear-cut Darwinian predictions, and it kind of drove me nuts to see it associated with evolutionary psychology, because there's a very kind of casual armchair version of evolutionary psychology. Of course, some of its critics believe that everyone who engages in it does that, but the fact is that the serious evolutionary psychologists are driven nuts by the kind of, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, like any anecdote you have about sex differences must have some kind of grounding in the genes. So I just want to make that distinction. Okay.
So, by the way, he did specifically cite the phrase evolutionary psychology in defending...
Oh, the Google memo guy did?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, he used that phrase, evolutionary. Okay. He said, here are some of the differences between males and females, and these are just what would be predicted by evolutionary psychology.
I kind of scanned his memo. I definitely remembered that a number of the differences he was citing actually don't follow from some kind of strong Darwinian prediction. If he's saying all of them do, I have a real issue with him. And of course, he's not himself a psychologist. But
there were the two main things were women are more into people, men are more into things, and the other one was
there are so many predictions that are so much. That's not a particularly strong prediction from
the other one was
Darwinian theory.
And the other one was that women score higher in neuroticism, which he also attributed.
That isn't either.
Whatever the justification is. Okay, so I want to go back to you cited, let's say, sexual behavior as one area where you think Darwinian theory really has a lot to say. And here's the problem I have with that. It seems to me that you're saying one difference that some evolutionary psychologists harp on is women tend to be less promiscuous and much choosier in whom they mate with than males. And certainly, any casual observation of the world around us would say that that's so. The problem I have is saying that is instinctual somehow. I'm not saying it's not instinctual, but I'm saying that from the time when they're very young, little girls are taught to be wary of little boys, and they start learning about this thing called sex, and they learn that they have a lot more to lose than boys do from sexual encounters. They learn about pregnancy. They learn about social disapproval if they are promiscuous. So the problem that I've always had with evolutionary psychology is that there is so much the boundary between what is instinctual, what is innate, what is biological, and what is rational and learned is so blurry. And too many evolutionary psychologists, I think, attribute to instinct things that, to me, are also obviously learned by any rational little girl. By the way, going back to this claim that females are more neurotic than men, I would think that that's kind of an expected prediction in a culture that's sexist, and a culture in which, as we're learning now, women are routinely harassed and subject to all kinds of intimidation from men.
I'm almost surprised to hear that was in the memo. It's not even consistent with my experience. I mean, I know a ton of neurotic men and a ton of neurotic women. I mean, there may be anxieties about different things. I have no. Don't look to me to defend. I mean, let me say two things. First of all, we're not going to. We said at the outset we'd get into science, sexual harassment, and stuff in science, which we should turn to shortly. Mm-hmm. The other reason I want to turn to it before too long is because the issue you're raising, I mean, I wrote several chapters of a whole book I wrote are about it, and the only way to really understand the nature of the argument from evolutionary psychology is to read the chapters. It's really, but I would say a few things. I mean, first of all, obviously, what you point to is a reason this is a very difficult thing to analyze. It's a lot harder than physics.
Yeah.
And so you kind of do the best you can. And you look at various kinds of evidence, and there are lots of kinds. And also, I want to say the prediction isn't that women are Victorian, the Victorian ideal of like chastity. There are definitely, from an evolutionary psychologist's point of view, it makes sense in Darwinian terms, quote sense. For not to say it's morally good or bad or anything, but for women to cheat on mates. And blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. So it's not like women are naturally monogamous. That said, differences are posited. And the range of evidence includes things like this, okay? Darwin had noted, like, broadly across the animal kingdom, females are choosier about sex partners than males. Okay, this is a broad thing that the females are deciding whether they will let a given male mate. Okay, mm-hmm. And he didn't actually come up with the what is now the accepted explanation because it's maybe a little subtle. But anyway, then when somebody said, well, look, wouldn't you think it has something to do with the fact that females can only can reproduce much less often than males. So obviously for a male, if you can in theory impregnate a different female every hour, obviously that's the optimal Darwinian strategy. You don't need to be choosy. You just do it. But the female, an egg is a rare and precious thing. She's only going to produce how many it depends on the species, but many fewer. So she has to assess the genetic quality of the mate and blah, blah, blah. Now, you'll accept, first of all, that's not a bad common sense explanation. But how would you test it, right? Difficult to test. Well, it turns out there actually are species in which the female can reproduce more often, okay? Like there's some sort of seahorses or something where the male has a pouch and the female produces the eggs, but after the fertilize, they're deposited in the pouch. And the male's just got to and there are birds where the male winds up, I think, sitting on the eggs. Anyway, there are species where the female can reproduce more often than the male. And if this theory is correct about the source of the more general pattern, then you would expect the behavior to be reversed in these cases. And that seems to be the case. Okay, so that's a kind of test of the hypothesis. Now, it's not the kind of test, and I'm not saying it's definitive. There's lots of realms of evidence, okay, ranging from cross-cultural survey to looking at different primates, and looking at there's all kinds of things like correlations between sexual dimorphism, that is to say, how different the sexes are in size, and as I recall, the degree of reproductive variation among males. And I'm not going to get into how all of this starts to make sense in terms of Darwinian theory. But there's lots of kinds of evidence, and all I have to say is either read the book or a comparable book, or quit dismissing evolutionary psychology. You're not going to get it in 5 minutes, and it's a serious discussion, and there are a lot of evolutionary psychologists who are good and have thought about it carefully, and some who are bad, and they're easier to dismiss. But I mean, there's about 10 different arguments of the kind I just mentioned about the sex differences across species. And you can either pay attention to all this different kind of argumentation and evidence, or my recommendation would be quit saying evolutionary psychology is just so stories. We have people in the comments section here who are going to say it this time, but they haven't, they'll do it again. They'll say evolutionary psychology, it's just so stories. But they could not, right. If you said, well, what is the evidence you're dismissing? They couldn't have cited what I just said to you probably, and they couldn't cite 30 other things.
Okay, I know the literature pretty well, Bob. I've read your book. By the way, I had
yeah, but you don't remember the arguments. You couldn't cite another one probably right now. What's another argument? Let me just sort of back up. First of all, I wanna. This is a little bit of a digression, but one of the greatest Darwinian thinkers of all time is this guy Robert Trivers, who came up with the idea of reciprocal altruism and parental investment, and made some really fundamental contributions to the science of human nature in the early 70s. And I had him come to my school to give a talk about must have been maybe 5 years ago. And after his talk, which was great, and it was mainly about deception and self-deception, he met with my science writing class. This is like, a dozen kids. And we're talking, and I said, well, come on, Bob. We know that evolutionary psychology sort of goes too far in making claims about humans, and some of its stories are what Stephen Jay Gould has called just so stories. And Trivers gave me this steely-eyed look, and he said, "Oh, really?" He said, "Give me an example of overreaching by evolutionary psychology. Give me an example of one of these just so stories, John." And I suddenly realized that it was like
I had just criticized quantum mechanics to like Niels Bohr or Heisenberg or Schrodinger or somebody like that. And I suddenly was panic stricken because again, he's looking at me like an alpha male predator, and I'm in front
Maybe
of my.
You're reading too much into his gaze, but go ahead.
No. And I'm in front of my pack, and my pack is looking at me, and I'm like, okay, I'm their alpha male, but here's this other guy. That's a real alpha male. And so the example I came up with was the female versus male sexual behavior, and I made the same point that I just made to you, which is that I think a lot of female sexual behavior is just rational. It's learned. It's sensible, given that females learn very early on that they have a lot more to lose from sexual encounters than males do. And Trivers kind of nodded, and then he cited some of these studies just showing how robust this kind of sexual dimorphism is, both in humans across the world and in other species. So
you
he
mean
said
the physical differences?
No, he was talking about sexual dimorphism and behavior.
Sexual asymmetry and behavior. Yeah.
I just wanted to point that out. The problem that I have with evolutionary psychology, one of the problems is the context in which it happens, which is that we still live in a sexist culture where women are subject to various kinds of harassment. And I think that there is something sort of implicitly derogatory about saying that a lot of women's behavior is instinctual as opposed to rational and learned. Yeah. That seems to me to be putting women down in a subtle way. And
wait. It's like you're saying the same thing about the men, and not all of that behavior is laudatory by any means. And I want to emphasize, we're not saying any particular behavior is like rigidly programmed. These are differences in psychology that, other things being equal, will tend to encourage certain kinds of behaviors, are not beyond changing, and so on. But look, it's not like it's. I mean, who has come out looking worse in these recent publicity, men or women?
Absolutely. Here's another point I wanted to make, though. This is sort of a more general point about human sexuality, which I think is, in some ways, of course, continuous with that of other species, but is also discontinuous because we do absorb so much from our culture, and we shapeshift. Deirdre McCloskey, who I just mentioned, is a kind of extreme example of the changes that modern humans can undergo. Both McCloskey and Alison Gopnik, the psychologist I mentioned earlier, view sexuality as something that is very fluid. Gopnik said something
fine,
really
but John, in the Deirdre McCloskey case, it took hormonal manipulation, and she reports that, yes, her psychology changed fundamentally. I mean, I would think that you're arguing the evolutionary psychology case here.
No, I'm
if you physically manipulate the hormones and steer them in the direction of a male, the psychology changes. I mean, that's kind of my line, right?
I'm trying to make a more general point about how I think the human nature is something that is so. It seems to me that scientists keep wanting to pin down human nature, and human nature refuses to be pinned down. Let me just make a point that Alison Gopnik made about sexuality, because she had a really interesting experience that she has written about and that I talked to her about when I interviewed her. Her marriage fell apart, and I can talk about this publicly because she's talked about it.
She's talked about it on this very platform, but yeah.
Okay, so one of the most fascinating things that happened to her was that her marriage fell apart, and she had considered herself absolute 100% heterosexual up until then. She had never been interested in women. She had a lesbian friend, and they had even talked about how hardwired sexuality is. And Gopnik had assured her friend, "No, I am just there's no lesbian in me." Then her marriage fell apart, and Gopnik fell in love with this woman, and they had a sexual affair. Mm-hmm. And so Gopnik, I asked her to sort of tell me what she had concluded about sexuality from this, and she said that she thought that much of our sexuality is defined by taboos. So she has all these male friends, and she says, how do you feel about your sexuality? And a lot of them most of them assure her, I am 100% heterosexual. And she says, you don't know that unless you have really tested it. You don't know that unless you can forget about any of the taboos, forget about all the brainwashing you've undergone since you were a little boy, telling you that homosexuality is wrong, even if you're a progressive liberal who says it's fine for other people who are to be homosexual. But I'm not that way. She said, you don't really know until you try it. And this goes back to the question that I posed at the beginning of this. What if we have no fear? What if there are no taboos? What kind of people do we become? What kind of people are we sexually and in other ways? But sexually is what I'm really interested about. And do men become predators? I'd like to think we wouldn't be. And in part, it's because I actually believe in female sexual selection. I think that females have selected sort of nice guys for monogamy who are going to stick around and help the woman.
Well, the question isn't who's sticking around and helping the kids. First of all, strictly speaking, the question is who are the women actually sleeping with. And one
Sure.
point, about evolutionary psychology is it does not reinforce the stereotype that women are naturally monogamous. And
Right.
I mean, look, you tell me. In college or wherever you were last, like part of a dating scene, was it your experience that women are always sexually attracted to the nice guys and not the big, strong asshole guys? Give me a
No.
break. Give me a break.
These are all tendencies.
Right.
And you also have to distinguish between casual sexual affairs or even one night stands and, marriage.
Well,
and
fine,
commitment.
but one night stands can get a person pregnant.
Yes, right. Yeah. This all reinforces my sense that sexuality is really complicated and fluid, and we're right in the middle of it. And we're trying to conduct these experiments, and to figure out what is really biological, what is part of human nature, and what is cultural and learned and a product of our desire to conform, because we're all basically sheep too.
Okay, let me say one more thing about this. Then I'm going to insist that we turn to the question that I promised at the outset we were going to talk about, which is like sexual harassment in science and academia, because I'm pretty sure you have something you want to say about this. That's what I thought. That was the premise. But you've raised this. Let me just say one more thing about the difficulty, which I grant, of disentangling cultural forces from kind of genetic forces, and also give you an idea of a different kind of evidence that evolutionary psychologists have drawn on in the past. Martin Daly and Margot Wilson. Margot's no longer alive, but they were they were both a couple, and they were co-researchers, really important researchers in evolutionary psychology. And by the way, a number of women, like Lita Cosmides, have done important work in evolutionary psychology. This isn't like just a male enterprise.
Sure.
But anyway, Martin
Sarah
and Margot, what's that?
Sarah Blaffer Hrdy.
Yeah, a lot of them. But Martin and Margot noticed that, theoretically, you would think that jealousy differs in men and women to some extent. That, both would be concerned about both sheerly sexual infidelity and emotional infidelity. In other words, if you think of two kinds of infidelity, one being just having sex with somebody, whether you like them or not, and the other being romantic attraction to another person who's not in your marriage or in your, regardless of whether they've had sex, right? Then you would imagine that males, relatively, that both men and women would get jealous about both things, because both of them, if you're in a marriage, both of them could be bad news in Darwinian terms, whether it's sexual or emotional infidelity. But you would expect men to be particularly focused on sexual infidelity, because if the woman is fooling around on the side, that may be that this man is spending all his time rearing kids who don't have his genes, which in Darwinian terms is a disaster. So you would expect an acute aversion to sexual infidelity in your mate to evolve in men. With women, you would certainly expect them to not like the idea of sexual infidelity in a partner, but you would expect them, relatively speaking, to be more focused on emotional infidelity, because if the partner leaves actually falls in love with another woman as opposed to just sleeping with her, that could have been catastrophic during evolution because there's no man to help rear the kids and so on. Okay, so that's the argument. Mm-hmm. And two things. One is they went back in the psychology literature and started doing a fine-grained analysis of the existing data on jealousy and found that psychologists who gathered the evidence with no Darwinian expectation at all, they weren't even thinking in these terms, had in fact documented this very asymmetry. It was there in the evidence gathered by researchers who weren't trying to sustain this hypothesis. And then I think David busted studies where he actually hooked men and women up and monitored their physiological responses to two scenarios. You know, imagine your partner sleeping with another person. Imagine your partner falling in love, blah, blah, blah. That seemed to corroborate it. There may have since been cross-cultural studies. There have been in other realms. David Buss has done some and others that tend to corroborate these things. All I want to say is that's a whole different that's a different kind of evidence from the kind I mentioned in the first place. Again, it's not definitive. No evidence is going to be, and it doesn't get around the fundamental problem you mentioned, which is that cultural upbringing often, seems to correspond kind of to these Darwinian expectations. So you don't know for sure that it isn't largely or even entirely a result. The observed asymmetries aren't a result of this cultural programming. Now that said, one more thing. When you find certain fundamental differences to be broadly cross-cultural, and there do seem to be some that are, you at least have to ask, well, why in these cultures that evolved independently, right? Like Polynesian society versus, European society or something. Why do you see certain, at least at a broad level, tendencies evolve? I mean, isn't it kind of a coincidence that mere cultural evolution would in all these cases move to the same place? Okay, just say one more thing and I'll try to refrain from responding because I really think we should get on to what we promised to talk about.
A couple of different things. Listen, I've always found evolutionary psychology fascinating and certainly suggestive. I don't dismiss it the way some critics do. I find corroboration for it, but when I look within myself and when I look at people around me to some extent, but even talking about this jealousy, these jealousy differences, and let's say something that's even better known, which is, the cartoonish version is, women dig guys with lots of money and guys are just looking for pretty girls. That's kind of the one of the cliches of evolutionary psychology.
Well, it's not the way any actual evolutionary psychology would put it. So don't waste your time debunking it.
No. But here, let me just make the point. But there's plenty. But there are evolutionary psychologists who are basically saying that's another difference between male and female sexual preference. And the way that I explain that is not necessarily. You're talking about cultural factors, brainwashing, let's say, and versus biology. I'm also talking about what's sensible, what's rational for people to do. It seems to me that in a sexist society where women have fewer options than men, it is sensible for them to look for a mate that has resources. And in a society like that, it's not as important for males to find a mate that also looks like she has, especially in the old days when women in our culture were even working.
But last time I checked, which was years ago, they'd actually done studies examining that. I think what you're saying suggests that when there are in modern society women of tremendous means,
yes,
they've earned a lot of money and so on, and they've gone to the finest law school and so on, that you would expect, according to you, the behavior to start changing, and they become kind of indifferent to the social status of the mate and more attentive to other factors. And last time I checked, that your side of the argument had not been borne out by that data.
Well, again, I would just say that women who have achieved success through hard work are loath to have a guy as a kind of appendage.
Well, okay, but then why are men into trophy wives. Why would your expectation be different for the two sexes?
Some are and some aren't.
Well, no, but there is a statistical difference. Come on.
Well, I would say that the statistical difference would have to do with the gender imbalances in our society. But the basic point I'm trying to make here is really it's a very basic one, which is that when science is talking about human nature, it should be. I mean, we are the most fascinating things in the universe,
and the most complex,
and science is never more consequential than when it talks about us.
Right.
Because the claims that science makes can have an enormous impact. If you look at the effect, even a wrong theory can change the culture profoundly. Right. Marxism, for example. You look at how Marx affected the 20th century. Look at psychoanalysis. Look at Freud's ideas about human nature. People still think like Freudians. We can't help it because we're so imbued with those different ideas. And I think it's because there's actually some truth to Freud's ideas, which overlap with some of the truths of evolutionary psychology.
So what you're saying, scientists should be more social scientists and psychologists should be more cautious in making claims than physicists?
Yes.
Okay,
definitely.
but listen, here's the deal. False beliefs about human nature in general can be damaging. Yes. It doesn't matter whether it's a scientist or not. So if you're, to get back to the current context, if you're a male and you treat some woman like a sex object and like have a one-night stand and maybe without realizing it, as males have been known to do, you're kind of subtly sending signals suggesting, when you're doing the seduction, suggesting greater commitment than there will actually be, okay? You may not even be aware of that. But if the next day you go, hey, what's the big deal? I just wanted to have sex once with her. Men and women are the same. Why shouldn't I have assumed that it would mean exactly the same for her and she would see me as a sex object? Why shouldn't it? Now, if that belief is false, if that assumption of symmetry is false, as I believe it often is, then that man has done damage on the basis of a false belief. But you're fine with this false belief because a scientist didn't assert it? No, listen. A false belief is a false belief, and a damaging false belief is a damaging false belief. So it seems to me that the best strategy is for scientists to do the best they can to get to the bottom of things. And by the way, on this particular point of like whether men are, and again, it isn't that men can't fall in love. Men can fall in love, but men can also, I think more often than women, be aroused sheerly by the physical aspects of the relationship, regardless of the personality or anything. And by the way, if you look at pornography around the world, sheer visual pornography, right, just the sight of the flesh being appealing, is, if you can show me a single society in which that is not more of a male market than a female market, I will begin to revise my beliefs. But I don't think you can. And again, that's just one more kind of evidence that is brought to bear, and there's a lot. But the point I'm getting back to is false beliefs can do damage even if they're not put forth by evolutionary psychologists. So why not just try to get to the bottom of things, even when you realize that human nature being so complex, you will rarely be 100% confident in your findings.
What I like, two things. I think the deepest truth of evolutionary psychology is something that you've talked a lot about, and that Robert Trivers has also talked about. Trivers wrote a book on deception and self-deception, which I think is actually quite deep. And he examines himself. He talks about it from the individual scale. He talks about his own life, right up to the scale of nation states who are deceiving themselves about their own actions, about United States self-deception that leads to, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and countries like that. And so the irony is that evolutionary psychology can be cautionary in the sense that I'm asking for from social scientists, because it talks about how difficult it is for us to know ourselves. Impossible, really, which is something that Freud also talked about. since you brought up pornography, I just have to mention that I wrote a blog post a few years ago on something called monster porn, which my girlfriend alerted me to. Monster porn is this bizarre genre, and it caused some debate because Amazon wasn't sure that it wanted to be selling these products. It's fantasies. It's written by women, and it's fantasies about having sex with like Bigfoot or a giant sea serpent or Tyrannosaurus Rex. It's just like crazy, totally weird stuff. And so I wrote a little piece about this just to say this just is another example of how sort of wildly unpredictable sexuality is, in this case, female sexuality, that women are writing these things and that there's a market for them, that enough women are buying this stuff to help the writers put their kids through college. So it's I don't want to just say, wow, it's mysterious, throw our hands up and say nothing more than that. You can say a lot. Evolutionary psychology has told me a lot. It's given me some really useful insights into my own behavior and the behavior of others, but it also leaves me with a sense of humility and trying to understand myself and my species. That's all. That's the only point.
As it should, and not, as you suggest, not just because we're so complex, but because according to evolutionary psychology, we are not designed to be in touch with our actual motivations. We are designed to sometimes be deluded about our actual motivations.
Right.
I mean, that's my last book was I wrote a book about Buddhism that argues that Buddhism had this part right, that we live in a world of illusion, and natural selection helps explain why.
But again, I have to make the point. This gets back to my first question: whether men are beasts. What are we when you take the fear away? Because there are these people who are, I think, genuinely enlightened. And to me, enlightenment means, I've always thought that an essential component of it would have to be fearlessness. What are these fearless men, and these gurus tend to be men, like? Some of them are like sexual monsters. I would say they're not enlightened, but well, then you're defining enlightened in a way that pleases you morally. But I'm saying
you're defining it your way. I'm defining it. I'm not alone, by the way. A lot of Buddhists would say, if you are continuing to do anything fundamentally selfish, you are definitely not enlightened. That's just fundamental almost to Buddhism.
Okay, so I might have mentioned him last time. This great Tibetan Buddhist monk, Trungpa, who brought Tibetan Buddhism to the West in the 60s and 70s.
Trungpa Rinpoche.
Yeah, and he was extremely promiscuous. He was drunk. He was a bully, and I know people who knew him, and they say he was definitely as enlightened as anybody that they had ever met. And his attitude was morality just didn't matter at all. He followed his appetites.
Well, fine, but the point, well, oh man, I guess we're not going to get to sexual harassment in science. We've been talking we should save that for a separate conversation. On the Buddhism point, I mean, look, you've met people who said he was enlightened. Fine. I say he's not. Now we're even. I mean, look, the idea of appetites, and people differ about this, and you can definitely reach really like transcendent states that are very different from ordinary consciousness, and in many ways involve more clarity of vision that don't involve the surrender of the appetites. But the very first famous sermon of the Buddha says that the source of our suffering is craving, tanha. And the release from suffering involves the vanquishing of craving, of tanha. So if you are a guru sitting there craving sex with somebody, I'm sorry, but according to traditional Buddhist standards, you are not enlightened.
You're not
There's
craving.
no point. I mean, it's just, this is no point in going on about this. That's a view, my view. You can find very good meditators who have a different view on the question of whether enlightenment should entail these kind of moral dimensions, but I think the view I'm putting out is a fairly traditional one.
What happens when the fear is gone? That's a question that actually haunts me.
Right, but fear, getting rid of fear is not the only part of enlightenment by any means. But we get back to, unfortunately, when the fear goes, we can see some pretty bad behavior. And I think that is itself a statement about human nature. I think that we ignore the dark side of human nature at our peril, and I don't just mean men. I mean of human nature generally. And the other thing I'd say is, it is my firm belief. I mean, you just mentioned a sense in which evolutionary psychology can be put to left-wing uses. When Trivers talks about foreign policy and wars and so on as being, in a sense, a result of delusion. I just want to emphasize that to say that there are some meaningful sex differences in the realm of sexual psychology, is not necessarily some kind of patriarchal plot. I mean, my view is that many men exploit women and use the assumption of exact sexual symmetry to facilitate their exploitation. They sexually exploit them, and their excuse is, I had no reason to think that she wasn't viewing this exactly as I'm viewing it.
That's a good point.
I'm telling you, evolutionary psychology gives you a very good reason to suspect that a woman may not be viewing a sexual encounter exactly the way you're viewing it.
Well, so does just a sensible view of sexual relations in the United States in 2017, or in the modern era, especially in situations where there is a power imbalance. That's just, any idiot can see that that's a situation that could lead to abuse, and obviously has led to abuse in science as well as all these other realms.
Yeah, but what I'm talking about would hold even if there weren't a power imbalance. The power imbalance, is that becomes a problem in its own right. Seeing what a lot of men do once there's a power imbalance isn't exactly inconsistent with some ideas from evolutionary psychology. And
let me say this about your use of evolutionary psychology. I think it is a vicious slur, even though I have sometimes raised it myself, that evolutionary psychology exonerates bad behavior, like, let's say, extreme sexism and sexual harassment. Right. There's this famous book by two evolutionary psychologists claiming that rape was originally an adaptive behavior, and critics said, "Oh, okay, these guys are saying that rape is natural, therefore it must be good in some sense." That's ridiculous. That I think you have showed that evolutionary psychology can help us become better people by understanding the sources of our bad behavior, and that's a big theme in your new book. It was a big theme in The Moral Animal too, and I totally get that.
Sounds like there's a but coming.
No, there's no but. I've tried to. Well, maybe the but would be it's limited in its effectiveness, but I've sort of internalized it, and I try to understand my own behavior and to become a better person by recognizing my sort of animal nature. So thank you for that, Bob.
We end on exactly the note I'd hoped to end on. So we've been going an hour. I mean, we just can't do justice to the story. So should we have a whole nother conversation about that?
No, I think we have done justice. Well, like sexual harassment.
Well, quickly. Let's just do like 5 minutes. Here's my thing is, like, it's just interesting that this, what we've recently seen, which is a lot of women coming forth and naming names about men who have not been good, has happened in certain fields. It's happened in journalism. It's happened in entertainment. And in a way it makes sense, because in journalism, you have a fair number of women, and they're journalists. They document things and they write about them. And so, that it makes sense that, when you've got kind of a critical mass. I mean, I think one thing that's happened generally is it's technological. The technologies have allowed, like there was this online document called Shitty Men in Media, which is how these various women who had stories about the same guys, I think, got in touch with each other. So part of it is technology allows, once there's a critical mass of aggrieved women within a field, it allows them to speak out, and then the ball starts rolling. Now, this hasn't happened in science or academia, whereas I had sent you this, we can link to this piece from Science where these two women are noting that surveys have shown that 50% of women in science or maybe academia broadly say they've been subject to sexual harassment. And I've heard stories from women who in academia who say, oh, sure, there's a grapevine where they talk to each other about which guys to worry about and, be careful about. And yet, names have not really been named. This has not hit science the way it's hit journalism and entertainment, and to some extent the tech world. Well, what name of a scientist has emerged?
There was a big case 2 years ago. A guy named Jeff Marcy, who was a possible candidate for a Nobel Prize, one of the best exoplanet hunters ever. Looking for planets and going around other stars, really a big deal. And turned out that these women came forward and made claims that he had been really sexually aggressive with them, and he was kicked out of Berkeley. That was the end of his career. And there was a lot of discussion of sexual harassment in science then. That was 2 years ago. So it was almost as though there was that little wave in science before this current tidal wave of attention to this issue. But there's been a lot of discussion in science about sexual harassment, and it's understandable why it would happen, because science, in principle, it's supposed to be so democratic and it's a meritocracy, but of course it's very hierarchical. And you've got the head of the lab, the sort of the big shot scientist who's got postdocs and graduate students who are just craving attention and approval, and they want to get authorship of a big paper. So that's a situation where young females can easily be taken advantage of. By the way, this has also hit philosophy.
Well, you mean is it Colin McGinn? Is that his name?
Yeah, there's Colin McGinn. There's John Searle, is one of the great philosophers.
I hadn't heard about that.
Also at Berkeley, he's had these accusations made against him. And I have heard from various people, including a bunch of female philosophers I know, that philosophy is incredibly sexist. There's almost this kind of gladiator culture within philosophy, and females are made to feel unwelcome because they are not aggressive enough. And this also manifests as sexual harassment by some philosophers, male philosophers of younger female philosophers. So I think it's all going to come out, and it is coming out.
Yeah, I don't know if it will. I also think, I don't know. Academia is such an unusual power structure. First of all, the men are not going to be let go as readily as they've been let go in journalism because they have tenure. It's not like, it's like there's one a day in journalism. Yesterday was Ryan Lizza, and it's like the New Yorker can say, we're severing our relations, and that's the end. There's no, whereas I think if you've got tenure, right, and you've got, it's not, and in fact there was a guy at the Princeton Engineering School, and this was maybe a year ago, who was pretty lightly reprimanded when it seemed that there was clearly something untoward going on. I almost wonder if the same case happened now in the post-Weinstein climate, whether they would deal with him more harshly. But I think they would definitely, and they already have. This guy Marcy was forced out, and he was one of the most prominent scientists in the world. He was certainly a star at Berkeley. So, and I think 2 years later now, it just seems to be that, universities, corporations, whatever they are, they're going to err on the side of what looks ethically proper, even without giving a full hearing to some of these people. But when you think about it, the power is at least as great as in a number of other vocations, and maybe more so, because it's like, if you're a fairly talented but young journalist, and your boss is a creep and you leave, you've got some shot of, it's not like you got some reasonable chance of getting a job at another place probably. Whereas in academia, I mean, it just doesn't happen like casually that, oh, now I'm a grad student at Berkeley in their PhD program, but next week I'm going to Stanford. It just doesn't happen like that, right? I mean, the process is itself is such a kind of ordeal.
Well, and at any university that tries to hire somebody who's been let go because of inappropriate sexual behavior, that new university, there are going to be people there who protested very publicly. So I think universities are extremely sensitive to sort of.
Yep. Yeah. But what I'm talking about is the difficulty the graduate student would have. The victim of the harassment would have just really readily, easily moving to another university. And that's not impossible, but it's not a frictionless move.
Yeah.
But
listen, I think it's great. I think this moment it's weird that you'd think that this would have been something that happened 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when I was young. That was like the heyday of feminism. But I feel like there's more potential for fundamental change now because of all these revelations. I hope it doesn't just sort of degenerate into gossip and a bunch of lawsuits that have no lasting changes on culture. I think I'm hoping that there will be some lasting changes.
Well, I think new norms will probably evolve, and some of them will be uncomfortable, and they'll lead to like maybe just erring on the side of caution and going, well, I guess I do not compliment women on their clothing,
Right.
Just not at all, even in cases where it couldn't remotely be construed, as something it's not. But, but that's probably not a very high price to pay, if it ends a lot of, super creepy behavior. And it won't end all of it, of course. What?
And women decide how we talk about this, and I feel as though they should be telling us what it's okay to do and say at this point, and we'll see where that leads. I'm really curious, and I hope it does lead to.
I do think people deserve their day in court, and I think in some it's starting to get like. Some of the reactions, some of the firings are starting to seem pretty quick. And you don't know enough to know if the person has gotten their day in court.
Right.
So I have some concern about that. On the other hand, I don't know enough to know that the magazine wasn't justified, say, in firing Ryan Lizza. I don't know. They're not talking about it. He's, so you just don't know. But that's the only caution I would... I'm fine with the new norms, and I'm fine with, easy for me to say. I'm an old guy, right?
And you're a gentleman, Bob.
And I'm a gentleman, yes.
And I think I am a gentleman. I try.
You are a gentleman.
But my daughter has told me that I reviewed some of my behavior for her. This is my 22-year-old daughter. And she has told me that I still have a lot to learn. So,
is it anything besides not complimenting women on their clothes?
Yeah, it's that, and I even tried to have a conversation with a colleague about all this.
Yeah,
about all the accusations and the men that the heads rolling and all that. And my daughter said, "Dad, no."
Well, see, this is one more thing I'd say that is kind of. I don't know how I feel about this, but you find yourself sometimes you're about to say something. I mean, this hasn't actually happened to me lately in this context, but I just know it will happen. That, like, you're about to say something to a woman about sex or something that is exactly the thing you would say to a man, but you realize, whoa, and then you have another problem, which is, wait a second, now there's a kind of bias I'm exercising in things I talk about with men versus women, and I guess that's okay, but it's a kind of cost, and it's a it's complicated.
Yeah, again, I think I'm sort of letting women give me the cue as to when those conversations are okay. And I regret it a little bit because I want to, it's great because there are some women I can talk about this with safely, I think, like my daughter, my girlfriend, fortunately. I just saw my sisters recently.
All those are completely safe relations. There's no ambiguity there.
Right.
The problem is ambiguity where what your intention is not, is up for debate.
I'm reaching the point where I'm so old where I think I'm becoming a non-sexual creature.
Oh, totally. I mean, it's like my brother said, I quote him in my latest book, my brother said this is when he was younger than me, and, he reached a point where women weren't really looking at him much, and he said, it's not that they think I'm bad looking, they just don't realize I exist.
Yeah.
That's a very liberating stage of life.
Yeah. Sad but liberating.
A lot of temptations gone. Anyway,
I think we've aired the issue thoroughly.
Well, we've aired an issue thoroughly, which is evolution. Well, not even thoroughly, but we've aired issues thoroughly. I think there's a lot more to be said about sexual harassment and predation in science and academia, and it wouldn't surprise me if you start hearing more about it because there's been relatively little said. And it's an area that it's a place where it happens.
Yeah.
So, thank you, John. We'll see you next time.
Okay, Bob. A pleasure as always.
You bet.